Okay, looks like we have a number of people that have joined, so we will begin. Hello and Yali Madat. My name is Farzana Ramzan, and I will be the moderator for today's critical conversation. I serve as a senior monitoring and evaluation specialist with the U.S. Agency for International Development in the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security, and our division focuses on measuring the impact of climate change in some of the most vulnerable parts of the world. The Critical Conversation series has been conceived as an initiative aimed at engaging the entire Jamaat and others, but with a focus on 18 to 40-year-olds. The series aims to explore the critical questions of our time within the context of our faith. This year, we are fortunate to find Earth Day falling within the month of Ramadan and felt that it was important to reflect on faith and our responsibility to the environment. The Holy Quran contains many verses about water, rain, and crops that are to sustain us and warns us that as vicegerents of the earth, we are accountable for our care of the planet. Indeed, one verse says, "The creation of the heavens and the earth is indeed of greater magnitude than the creation of mankind, but most men do not understand." Quran, Surah 40, Ayat 57. So as there is a global threat to the planet, today we have a special session dedicated to exploring environmental governance and the impacts of climate change. We will have an opportunity for us to explore the impact of climate change, particularly on vulnerable populations, the development and governance of policies that promote environmental sustainability and foster a more just and equitable society. During this session, you will see a Q&A box through which you can share additional questions or thoughts during the presentation. We will address as many questions submitted during today's talk as we can at the end. With that, let me introduce our panelists. Thank you all for being here today to share your thoughts on this very important subject. We'll start with Helen Lopez, who has a long history in public service. She is the international liaison for the Governor of California's Office of Emergency Services, Cal-OES. As Assistant Director, she leads the International Affairs Office, where she works with the international community on emergency response efforts and coordinates delegation visits for countries from all over the world. She has been instrumental in developing memoranda of understanding on emergency management with various countries, including Chile, Mexico, Australia, and one with the Ismaili Imamate, known as the Agreement of Cooperation. There has been extensive collaboration between Cal-OES and AKDN and Focus Humanitarian Assistance, the Ismaili community's disaster management organization. We will be hearing more about this partnership. Helen's prior experience includes being the executive director of the State Board of Food and Agriculture, director of the Grant Management Program, and audit director of the Internal Audit Office, as well as the Mexico liaison. Next, we have Marta Segura, recently appointed as the first ever Climate Emergency Mobilization Director for the City of Los Angeles. She is also a leading expert in community health and engagement and has worked directly with public and private organizations to design and drive programs that promote healthier and more engaged communities. Martha previously served as program officer for the California Endowment and statewide associate director for Communities for a Better Environment. She also worked in creating parks and open spaces in the early years of the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust. Martha has experienced the impact of air pollution, living next to freeways, segregated substandard schools, and housing displacement as a result of a project that demolished her entire neighborhood in San Jose. We're also joined by Galeeb Kachra, who grew up in Kenya and emigrated to the US to complete his senior year of high school. Galeeb spent 2 years in Pakistan establishing the first natural disaster preparedness program for Focus Humanitarian Assistance. This program won the World Habitat Awards 2020 Gold Award. After returning to the US, he worked in both urban planning and environmental permitting in Massachusetts. From 2005 to 2015, he fostered sustainable international development with the U.S. Agency for International Development, including 7 years as a U.S. diplomat in Kenya. Most recently, he is working as a contractor with the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration on the West Coast, focusing on the environmental impact of fisheries and endangered species protection. Galeeb is also the author of How I Change the World in My Own Unique Ways, now available at your favorite ebook store. At the outset, we would like to note that the views of our speakers expressed during the course of this discussion are their own. Let's turn now to our guests. Helen, let's start with you. We have major threats in California, from drought and its effect on farming, a major economic asset, to reductions in the water table, earthquake threats, and wildfires. Would you please let us know how climate change is affecting the state?
First of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of this forum, and thank you for all the work that you all do for the communities and our earth. As you mentioned, climate change has been impacting California in many ways. Due to climate change, California has experienced droughts, mudslides, floods, tsunamis, and devastating wildfires. Just this last week alone, our governor declared a local regional emergency to a watershed in 2 of our counties that are experiencing a drought, and has directed the state to dedicate resources to prepare for another drought. And let's not forget, in 2014, we had California a 5-year drought that caused economic impact to our state and to our agriculture. And it is predicted that we're entering another drought. And wildfires. California, we have experienced so many devastating wildfires over the past several years. They are they're increased in intensity, and climate change is one of the major factors. In the past 5 years, California always has a fire season, but now it's become a year-round emergency. In 2020 alone, as we were combating COVID and responding to this pandemic, we experienced 9,000 fires, and 5 of those fires were considered to be among the top 20 that were recorded in California's history. In that year alone, there was a record of 4.2 million acres burned, damaging and destroying over 10,000 structures. Sadly, killing 31 people. Since 2014, we've had over 27,000 fires, causing the loss of life, property, and economic impact. In that year alone, the town of Paradise was practically destroyed when we had a fire that was so intense, so rapid, that many of the community members didn't have the opportunity to evacuate, and sadly lost their lives. With climate change, also, one of our counties in 2018, Santa Barbara County, they had a devastating wildfire season. And later in winter, it was followed by an atmospheric river storm that caused us a mudslide, killing 23 and also destroying over 100 residences. So really, as you see, climate change has caused devastating disasters, and we have to be prepared to be able to respond, and we have to prepare our vulnerable communities. So we here in California say this is our new normal.
Thank you. Yes, that is devastating. Perhaps Marta can provide some insight into local initiatives. Can you tell us about the objectives of the Climate Emergency Mobilization Program of the city? You're on mute.
Yes, hi. Thank you all. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. Yeah, the Climate Emergency Mobilization Office has a multifaceted roles and responsibilities, right? Of course, we want to address the climate emergencies, but we want to do so in a just, equitable, diverse, and inclusive way, because we found that policies, particularly climate policies that were developed in the past, had unintended consequences on the most vulnerable communities. So we want to have equity and justice front and center for the purposes of this office. And in doing so, we're going to have a commission launched with frontline communities, represented youth, labor, indigenous communities, so that we can hear from those voices up front, as we're developing these policies that will address some of the emergencies that Helen was talking about, because those emergencies, droughts, wildfires, et cetera, affect us all. And we all have to be engaged and we all have to be involved. So we're also going to have very bold civic engagement, which will include workshops and town halls, inclusive of the entire city, but lifting the voices again of the most frontline vulnerable communities, so that we don't have policies like cap and trade that really diminished emissions as a whole for the state, but ended up over polluting communities of color. And that's just one example of a unintended consequence of the design of that program that we want to avoid in the future with an office like ours. And then we have great local policies like LA 100 that has been launched by LADWP and the city of LA that which the goal is to reduce carbon emissions by 100% by 2035, so faster than the state SB 100. And it has 3 pathways that it's offering. But before deciding on a pathway, we're going to have a very robust civic engagement process that will include all these voices. So we decide on the pathway that we really need for Los Angeles, as an example.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that, Martha. We will come back to you soon to learn more about the city's plans. Galeeb, you have spent many years in development and international and environmental space. Would you please tell us more about your work, the impact of climate change on communities in Pakistan and Kenya, and what has been done to address this?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Farzana. This question really forces me to step back and look at the bigger picture of climate change, how to tie things together in 2 very different countries. In this case, the mountainous region of northern Pakistan and the semi-arid rural areas of Kenya. And when I try and tie them together, I think of 2 words: vulnerabilities and catalysts. So as I explain in the first chapter of my book, I was sent to northern Pakistan in 1999 to start a disaster management program for villages in the remote mountainous areas for focused humanitarian assistance. And they'd been charged with helping the villagers better prepare for and deal with these hazards. But these hazards has always been there, just like in California. In the case of northern Pakistan, there are floods, glacier movement, earthquakes, mudslides, landslides, and people in these hazards have coexisted for centuries. But what's different now is that you first got changes in humanity. You've got population increases with longevity and amenities. You've got communication with the outside world. You've got migrations and tourists. And you've got a lot more infrastructure, our nicer houses, our roads, cell phone towers, electricity lines, water lines, they're all very vulnerable to these kind of hazards. And so that's always been going on, and it's been going on more and more so now. But what does climate change have to do with it? And honestly, in 1999, when I was sent out there, we weren't even thinking about climate change. But in 2020, when the program won the UN Habitat Awards, climate change was at the forefront of that award. And, allow me to quote Prince Rahim Al Khan, who is the chair of the AKDN's Environment and Climate Committee, on the work that the focus was being recognized. He said, and I quote, "For decades, the AKDN has been working with vulnerable communities to improve quality of life and reduce disaster risk. Today, in the face of climate crisis, understanding and mitigating these risks is even more urgent. Only by helping these communities adapt and thrive in harmony with their often precarious habitat can we hope to mitigate the effects of climate change," end quote. So that's sort of where I got these 2 words from: vulnerabilities. The communities in northern Pakistan are vulnerable, just like the communities in California, to wildfires and drought that Helen discussed, or in Florida to hurricanes, for example. And the second word is catalyst. The climate change is making things worse. It's speeding things up. And so that's how I understand it happening in northern Pakistan. And then I can apply those same principles to Kenya. So in northern Kenya, cattle rustling and conflict over water have always been part of the landscape. It's just getting worse. Peace building efforts, you ask about what's being done. Peace building efforts are helpful, but they're not really sufficient by themselves. You need more holistic development. And then you have to consider the confounding factors. That climate change it's one thing happening, but it's not the only catalyst at play. Additional catalysts in northern Kenya are extremism, political turmoil in neighboring countries, poaching, food security, domestic politics, and corruption. So hopefully that sort of helps you, everyone sort of think about the impact of climate change on communities as disparate as Kenya and Pakistan, and only starting to scratch the surface of what's being done to address those nuances.
Excellent, thank you. And the framing around vulnerabilities and catalysts. We'll return to California now. Helen, can you tell us what the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services is doing about preparing for natural disasters and the work of the International Affairs Office? You're on mute, Helen.
Sorry. So to put it into perspective, as you know, California is a large state. We are the 5th largest economy. We have a population of over 40 million people with a diverse population and geography. We have 52 counties, and we have coastline, desert, it's mountainous, cities. And so we prepare for all hazards types of disasters, which is wildfires, earthquakes, drought. Our mission here at Cal OES is to protect lives, property, and build capabilities and support our communities for a resilient California. So we take the approach of a whole of a community, meaning that we incorporate all levels of government, such as the locals, state, federal partners, our tribal nations, NGOs, and the private sector in developing our plans and emergency plans and response plans. These partnerships are key to California. Government alone cannot do it by themselves to prepare our citizens and respond. So we use the California State Emergency Plan. Collectively, we create that plan, and this plan provides guidance and standardization for emergency operations using the Standard Emergency Management System. We have a process in there for rendering mutual aid. How do we inform the public during a disaster? And we describe resources mobilization. We also help the local governments in preparing their plans, and we get input from all of our stakeholders in developing these plans. Together, we developed catastrophic response plans, which are based on the worst case scenario that could happen in one of our regions. For example, we have 5 CAT plans: the Bay Area Earthquake Response Plan, the Southern California Response Plan, and most recently, the Northern California Flood Plan. And these plans, collectively, we develop them with our stakeholders, we maintain them, and we train and we exercise. So those are some of the big pieces, but I'll go also now into the standard emergency system. So in California, we use a standard emergency system, which was developed here in California when we had the Oakland fires. And it's a bottom-up approach, meaning that all disasters start at the local level and end at the local level. It incorporates incident command and a multi-agency coordination and mutual aid. All levels of government are required to use the system in order to receive funding. And so everyone understands their role when there's an emergency, and we use the same common terminology. A component of this emergency system is the California Mutual Aid System. And this is known to be the best in the world. And basically what the concept is neighbor helping neighbor. When a county has a disaster and they're becoming overwhelmed, they already have pre-existing agreements with other counties to provide them assets and resources. And we here as a state, we also have mutual aid agreements with many states that as we need help and we're becoming overwhelmed, we contact one of those states to deploy firefighting assets, firefighters, what have you. But that is one of the systems that works for California, and it helps us to be fully prepared. In regards to the role of the international affairs, as you mentioned, we are responsible for coordinating all international activities. This includes coordinating international delegation visits from all over the world. We have countries that come to visit Cal OES to meet with our subject matter experts to talk about best practices, lessons learned from a particular disaster, and identifying gaps and talking about training opportunities and capabilities. We also develop binational memorandums of understanding with many countries, one of which is with the AKDN focus. The purpose of these is to share best practices, training, share our latest technology, and identify future collaborations. During a disaster, we work closely with the consulates, the Mexican consulates, El Salvador, from all over the world. And our purpose here is to provide them resources when there's a disaster, identify their needs. And so we work hand in hand with all of them by providing them key information that's going to help the vulnerable population. We also assist in coordinating international aid. For example, last year, the beginning of the COVID, when PPP wasn't so much available, we worked with over 13 countries in coordinating those donations, and they sent those donations to us, which helped us tremendously, and we thank these countries for that. We also assist in the coordination of firefighting assets. Last year, while we were fighting COVID, we also received 20 firefighters from Israel, from Mexico, and from Canada. So our office is key, and we work with all our international partners, and we thank everyone for always supporting us.
Thank you, Helen. The California Governor's Office of Emergency Services, Cal-OES, signed a memorandum of understanding, as you said, with the Aga Khan Development Network's Disaster Risk Management Initiative and Focus Humanitarian USA. And under this MOU, Cal-OES has trained professionals, as you noted, at the Aga Khan Agency for Habitat and Focus in disaster response, emergency planning, risk management, mass casualty management, and many other related areas. Can you elaborate on the partnership between Cal-OES, the AKDN, Focus, and the Ismaili community?
Yes. As you mentioned, in 2009, the state of California did sign a cooperation agreement with the Ismaili Imam to collaborate on health, education, and disaster risk management. We entered into an MOU with AKDN in 2013. And some of the efforts is a lot of collaboration, a lot of training opportunities. And in 2018, the AKDN sent over a dozen health professionals to provide volunteer care to survivors of the Camp Fire in Paradise. They did this on their own dime, and they came from all over the country to assist. We have also done collaboration efforts of bringing delegations from the AKDN to train here with our people, and we have sent our superintendent of training to Dubai to be part of ICS training workshops. So we have a long-standing relationship. We work closely. We're constantly in communication, and through this partnership, we help one another. And it's always a beneficial training and sharing best practices.
Great, thank you so much, Helen. The Aga Khan Development Network has long focused on sustainable development, from water management to better building practices and reforestation. It was a major sponsor of 3 global climate summits held in California, and has also partnered with Prince William in the new Earthshot Prize. £1 million will be awarded annually to a winner in 5 categories that improve the environment. This is an exciting new endeavor, and the C40 Cities Initiative is also part of the global alliance that is partnering with the Earthshot Prize. LA's Mayor Garcetti is the current chair of C40. For reference, C40 is a network of mayors from the world's megacities committed to addressing climate change. C40 supports cities to collaborate effectively, share knowledge, and drive meaningful, measurable, and sustainable action on climate change. Martha, can you tell us more about C40 and its objectives?
Sure. Yeah, Mayor Garcetti, under the leadership or chairmanship of Mayor Garcetti, it's gone from C40, which means 40 mayors, to over 700 mayors across the globe. And because it has been recognized that sustainability and the climate crisis cannot be solved without being inclusive of everyone, especially vulnerable communities, one of its new initiatives is a green and just transformation. because it's absolutely necessary to see that we're putting excessive pressure on land, on water, on our planet. And if we don't do it, we don't develop in a way that is, like you were mentioning earlier, holistically with the land, water, and our planet, then we are going to continue to go in this path of self-destruction. So the Mayor Garcetti has initiated models here in Los Angeles that can be replicated across the world. And as you all probably know, under the former administration, when we pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, these mayors were the stronghold, right? In C40, this network of mayors continued to move forward on pressing forward with renewable energy technology investments, decarbonization, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And actually C40 mayors have had more of a global impact than the Paris Climate Agreement itself as a result. So we're very proud of the work that Garcetti and all the other climate mayors have done. But I did want to go back to the excessive pressure on land, because one of the reasons California has become more vulnerable is because so many like wildlife corridors that are also high risk for wildfires are being and have been developed on, right? So for example, there is this area in North LA County. It's not part of the city, but it's a good example. It's a wildlife corridor. It is high risk for that kind of activity, but there are these hedge fund developers that want to develop this whole area in North LA County, while the organizations that were advocating against it just won a judge's court order to stop the development because the claims the developer were making were for the most part false, right? In terms of their climate practices, they said that they would have a net zero impact on greenhouse gas emissions. And my point is this: there's lots of land in California that presents a high risk to homeowners, but is needed for biodiversity, and it's needed for its vegetation, it's needed for its trees, because we also have this thing called urban heat islands, right? And heat and drought combined in California, as in other parts of the world, is also something that is presenting a huge risk for Californians and Angelenos. And if we don't mitigate these urban heat islands that predominantly also affect the most vulnerable communities because they have less vegetation, they have less trees, they have less open space, then we're again going to have the vulnerable communities pay the highest price. But all of us will, because if these developers can build in these zones, right, those homeowners will suffer the consequences because they'll pull out of their investment. Taxpayers will suffer the consequences because we will have to pay for the redevelopment of that community. But then we'll have these wildfires happen again and again and again. So I think we do need to be more preventive and understand that we need to preserve the land, especially if it's both a wildfire corridor and a hazard for wildfires, and just begin to densify where the cities exist. And repurpose buildings that are now going to be 30 to 40% empty post-COVID. So there's lots of opportunities for reimagining, repurposing, and rethinking how we develop into the future. So we're not just responding, but we're actually preventing and mitigating the damage to Californians and as a whole, and being a model, right, for how we develop.
Thank you. Yeah, that's fascinating to learn about. And through C40, let's hope these cities can also encourage their national governments to take more aggressive action against climate change. And Martha, as you've noted, much of your work has been on building and supporting policies that create environmental sustainability with a particular emphasis on vulnerable communities. Can you share a bit more about the policies that help to create a more just and equitable community through targeting environmental degradation?
I think more than anything, over 2 decades of environmental justice advocates have been pushing for changes in how policy is made. And finally, it's made an impact on a national scale. So because the Biden administration has prioritized it. And I think it's because we have been, advocates like me who started 20, 30 years ago are now in government. So we have not forgotten the lessons of our early years as advocates and organizers. So now we're in the inside helping governments shape policy to address these inequalities, to address these vulnerable communities. And I think that the innovation that this office brings is including those environmental justice and economic justice community-based organizations, their constituencies, and finding a way that works to have this iterative dialogue with policymakers at the local level. And we want to make sure that this is a very creative, bold, and replicatable model so that it could be used at the state level, it could be used at the federal level. And as we were discussing earlier, it's going to be really necessary to track and monitor and evaluate the progress and the change with an equity lens. So right now we're tracking greenhouse gas emissions, for example. We're tracking perhaps green workforce, but we're not tracking it with an equity lens. And Justice 40, the Biden administration's initiative, wants to ensure that 40% of all infrastructure dollars and climate recovery dollars go into these vulnerable communities. And right now there's no real accurate way of tracking that. So we want to develop a tracking mechanism so that we can monitor that, track that, and prove that those investments are not just going into those communities, but actually making an impact. So just to summarize, it's super important that these vulnerable communities have a voice at the table and that they are integrated into the decision-making process, and that even when we have a policy, but we're in the process of implementing it, that we also have a voice at the table so that through its implementation, we can shape it so that it does invest in those communities and we don't have those unintended consequences that often come without them being at the table.
Yeah, it's great to learn about the community-based organizing efforts that you're leading. And, related to that, the Ismaili community's volunteers have worked for 2 decades with the city and local organizations on Martin Luther King Day and on Big Sunday in improving parks, planting trees, painting schools in marginalized areas, and in other environmental programs, similar with volunteer efforts that have been held regularly across the country. So really great to hear about some of your community organizing work and having that be integrated more formally with the state government and local government. Galeeb, the oceans are being polluted with plastic and other waste. There's overfishing and changes in water temperature. These are affecting marine life, the ecosystem, and the fishing industry, all at a time when we're being told to eat more fish. So can you tell us about the impact of these environmental threats and what policies are being implemented to confront them? Are they having an impact?
Yeah, thanks, Farzana. That's a pretty complex question. Everything from eating fish to not throwing straws away and not fishing, but fishing. And, I hope that I want to take the time to parse it out because I really hope that the people listening can realize you can't take a tweet or a meme or something and just try and act on it from a policy perspective. You have to kind of break it down into the parts, right? So the parts here you've asked about are what are the impacts of these environmental threats? What are the policies? And what are these policies having an impact? And I'm more of a visual person, so I'm going to just share my screen a little bit because that's just the way I work. So hopefully you can see this. And if I try and parse out this question, I think of what's going on with the oceans. You said eat more fish, but that also means more fishing. It means more extraction. There's a lot more energy and mining and stuff happening from the ocean. There's more transportation. And every time you buy an iPhone or new jeans, those are being shipped across the ocean. And so there's more transportation happening. There's more recreation. And there's more stuff going into the ocean. Shore-based waste, ship-based waste, intentional, unintentional. There's more stuff coming out of the ocean. Fish that we don't want, that's bycatch. Mammals are being caught. Mammals are being washed up on the shores of Oregon, Washington, California, as well as in the Atlantic Ocean right now. More birds are being caught. And more energy and mining is happening, as well as even desalination in California. So there's this overall sort of more theme. And then I think of the climate change catalyst that I mentioned earlier, right? You've got, and you can look up these terms, the scientific terms of them, but you've got ocean acidification happening, which sort of encompasses all the changes in calcium, oxygen, temperature. You've got the patterns happening. Helen talked about the drought in the past and the wildfires, all interrelated to the extreme weather events and the blobs, or the sort of local weather events off the ocean. And you've got a lot of turnover happening that didn't used to happen before in the currents, both at the surface and below the surface. So you've got all of these things happening in terms of climate change. And so you ask about what are the effects? And you've got effects on all the marine life that I mentioned and that you hear about in the news. You've got effects on ecosystem functions. You've got a lot more competition happening for the ocean waters. Aquaculture is a big one. Huge aquaculture projects being proposed off California right now. And the previous administration sped up the process for aquaculture development. This administration, that's one of the few executive orders that they've not reversed. That is still full speed ahead. And similarly, the current administration is speeding up wind farms and energy production off the coast. So these are going to be in competition with the fishing industry, and the fishing industry is already in competition with the environmental groups. You've got all of this stuff happening at the same time. So then you ask the question, okay, what's being done? And I have to say, not enough. But because it's so complex, and I'll just give you a little example. If you talk about fishing borders and enforcement, first of all, you've got vast areas of ocean that have to be enforced, and that can't happen. But you have borders. The states control from the coastline up to 3 miles out. The federal government controls 3 miles out up to 200 miles out. And then the international community has a say over the rest, but no one really controls it. But then you've got these other intricacies. In Washington, we have areas that are set aside for tribal governments. You've got a border with Canada right up next to us here in Washington. And so the fish don't respect boundaries, and the fishermen are fishing here and end up over there, and they don't necessarily respect boundaries. And yet, as policymakers, we divide the fish into little categories and say, you only catch this here and this there. So it's very complicated. And I just put some examples of this push and pull that's happening. You're being told to eat more fish. Fishermen are being told to catch less marine mammals or turtles. You've got a lot more trade happening. I mentioned clean energy. I mentioned aquaculture. The environmental groups are saying, do more innovation, come up with nets and pots to catch your shrimp and lobster that don't affect the turtles. The fishermen are saying, well, those cost $30,000, $40,000 per line, as opposed to $200 per line. Well, where's that money going to come from? And then you've got more poverty across the world that's driving more fishing, that's driving more food needs. And then you've got more subsidies. Even in the US, we talk about no subsidies, but in fact, the entire government agencies that run the fishing industry are all basically subsidizing the fishermen in a way. And so all of these things are happening. In other countries, the subsidies are probably even more, or different types of subsidies. But it's a pretty complex situation. And so when you put all of these together, you ask the question, what's the impact of it? And I start off with the positive. Hopefully we'll put into the link an example of a partnership here on the West Coast between the environmental groups and the fishermen and the resource agencies that said, you don't just close large areas of land, of water to fishing, but you pick and choose the most critical areas to close. It's not about the numbers. It's not about this 30 by 30 you'll hear. Let's close 30% by 2030. It's really about, would you rather close a whole area, a whole desert, or would you just protect the oasis? Obviously, you just protect the oasis. And so one example that took 5 or 6 years to happen on the West Coast that you can read about is pretty interesting. And then you've also got these partnerships for gear testing that I mentioned, but again, they require both parties coming together and discussing it and putting resources into it. And then probably one that sticks out the most in my head, one policy is the Marine Mammal Protection Act that was passed in the 1970s. It has really helped rebound marine mammal populations, especially seals and sea lions and the more common marine mammals that are out there. On the flip side, unfortunately, there's more damage. More damage happening with all these competing resources and competing uses. The situation is getting more and more complex as we now use the oceans not just for fishing, but factory ships. We use it for energy development. We use it for desalination, to get water, etc. And this idea that the marginalized are not benefiting, very important to this discussion today. The marginalized fishermen, the marginalized communities on the coast, their areas are being eroded pretty rapidly in some places. They're fishing, they get less access to fish. They have to go further and further away to fish. And it's very difficult for them to survive. But setting aside even the human marginalized, even think about the animals that are marginalized. Yeah, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, in my opinion, and I don't speak for the federal government or for any other organization I work for, but in my opinion, the marine mammals that are common, like sea lions and seals, have benefited from the Marine Mammal Protection Act. But the marginalized, the vulnerable, the orcas, the North Atlantic right whales, the ones that we see as the high-profile megafauna is what we call them, the ones that always make the news, the turtles, they haven't benefited from this at all. So even this idea of marginalization is not just restricted to the human world, but also to the animal world. Just to round out the impacts there, and then I'll stop and we can take this conversation further, is you've got more and more species across the world being overfished because people have to go further. They have their lands are being taken away by development, and so the farmers have to turn to, or the people have to turn to other types of food, which comes from the ocean, and fishermen have to coming back with more and more empty nets. I remember as a kid, I used to go in a glass bottom boat off the coast of Kenya, off the coast of Mombasa, and we used to look at all the corals and fish in the intertidal zone during high tide. When I went back as an adult and took my kids, in that same intertidal zone, there was just sand. It was like a desert. There was no coral, no fish, no nothing. And all of that comes from the different pressures that are happening not only upriver on the land, the extra sediment that comes down when you have deforestation, the different types of land use, but also the pressure in the ocean from the fishermen. So all in all, it's a very complex question that you have to parse out with a lot of thought.
Thank you, Galeeb. Yes, indeed, very complex. And thank you for sharing the visual to help us sort of navigate that more effectively. Martha and Galeeb, in your experiences in California, Washington, and internationally, it is usually the most vulnerable who are affected by climate change. What are some of the more successful policies that you have seen that actively work towards equity and justice while reducing the factors that contribute to climate change? Who would like to go first? Martha, you're on mute.
Hi there, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, I can go first. I think, we are just at the precipice of engaging the most vulnerable communities and their voices to create equitable policy. But there have been pieces of legislation that I think have included their input and their voices. For example, SB 100, and now at the local level here in Los Angeles, LA 100, there are both decarbonization policies. And although LA 100 has not been finalized and it's still in the process of being shaped, it very intentionally included and is including these marginalized communities to shape the final policy. But I want to combine it with a question that's been asked of me about a USC study linking urban oil wells with wheezing and reduced lung function. And that's a really important question because at the local level, there's a coalition by the name of Stand LA that has pushed for a 2,500-foot setback, which has led to a great deal of deliberation and study within the city of Los Angeles. But unfortunately, the city of Los Angeles does not have the jurisdiction to fine and shut down an oil well. That jurisdiction belongs to the state with this agency called CalGEM, right? So although our office is about climate emergencies, what we have is the power of collaboration, the power of influence, the power to engage these marginalized communities and others that are in fact impacted by the emissions from urban oil wells or urban oil drilling. And then the information that we collect can then inform the state, and the state can then take action, right? So we are very aware about the oil wells, particularly those near USC that are next to affordable housing units. And in fact, that coalition has been the face of that movement in not just Los Angeles, but all of California. And I think it's because of that setback legislation is being considered at the state level as well, not just at the local level. So there's like an interplay and a communication between state policy and local policy, because at some point we have to be consistent. But the main point here, I think, is that the jurisdiction for enforcement and for citing these oil wells and oil drillers with violations lies at the state level, but local representation, local studies, local policy also has an influence, because then we get this larger statewide legislation that can hopefully protect not just Los Angeles, but the entire state.
Yeah, Farzana, just to jump in here, I think that it's interesting, this this perspective of the marginalized, the more vulnerable, what the US calls environmental justice, has been around since President Clinton signed it in an executive order back in 1994. And if you look at some of the great initiatives that have been done in California, including some of the metrics that they have out there that track air pollution, communities, income levels. California has its, Martha, what's the name of the website?
Screen?
CalEnviro screen, and then EPA has its own EPA screen that encompasses the whole nation. They're great at tracking sort of this overlap between the pollution or the impacts and the vulnerable communities. But if I think of your question at a different perspective here, it's, you know, maybe I'm in a blind spot, maybe I'm not seeing it. And I hope that there are brighter, smarter people out there who are going to study this and who are listening, who may want to get involved in some ways. And we'll talk about involvement at the end. But, you know, I don't necessarily see these things as compatible. Based on my experience in the world, in Pakistan, in Kenya, and even here in the US, how people can cope with climate change, as Helen talked about, you know, the wildfires and the droughts and expecting more and more of it. If you look at these last couple of years, well, you have the marginalized had a high number of deaths from heat exposure, right? So whereas those who are more affluent can afford the air conditioning or can afford the environmental, climate controlled environment in their houses and workplaces, those people who can't afford it are the ones that are more likely to be adversely affected by climate change. So it's easy to see the relation between being vulnerable and being more affected by climate change. What I struggle to see is, how do you address climate change while addressing the marginalized? And I'm just missing it here. You know, so for example, if you want to reduce if you want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, you can switch your vehicle to an electric vehicle. Okay, assuming that the electricity comes from a clean source, which is a whole separate conversation. But if you can afford to switch your car to electric, you probably already have air conditioning at home. If you can only afford one, then which one is going to impact your quality of life in those hot summers? It's not the electric car. That benefits society. It's the air conditioning that will affect your quality of life and ability to survive those brutal summers. So I don't necessarily see that it's a one solution for both problems. I see them as sort of two different solutions, one at a policy level and a sort of communal nation approach, and one that comes down to the fundamental ways, whether it's in California or Washington or in Kenya or Pakistan, that the vulnerable need better support to develop. And that just comes to the traditional ways of development, but just on a faster time frame. And you mentioned at the beginning that this is really the month of Ramadan. It's the month for us to really sit and reflect and think about the vulnerable and these kind of our role as a steward on earth that the Quran and Allah gives us, because it is the only way with our intellect that we can help drive this thing forward into a more positive solution.
Right.
Can I add a little bit to that?
Sure. Yes.
So you're all right. I mean, climate change does impact the vulnerable population. So in 2019, the governor created the California Listos campaign, which builds on resiliency for the vulnerable communities, our immigrants, farm workers, and the undocumented, and prepares informational research information so that they be better prepared. We have created outreach material in 10 languages, and we pay close attention to cultural sensitivity. There's 5 emergency guides, disaster readiness in Chinese, Tagalog, Spanish, and Vietnamese. And these are designed to prepare families to better respond and prepare for a disaster. I have a copy of it here. It's in many languages. We have shared it with our community-based organizations, and they pass it on to the community. This campaign during the COVID response have been instrumental in creating PSAs, short videos in many languages that are passed to the community-based organizations and to the consulates. There have also been grants to the community-based organizations to be able to work directly with the community, because they are the trusted messengers and really get the message on better prepare, have an emergency plan, and prepare for any type of disaster.
Thank you, Helen. And we'll be sharing some of those resources as well with the participants. We do have questions from the audience, so I'll ask one last question. And Helen, if you could start, and we'll keep all of the comments brief so we can pivot to the audience questions. So the final question, what are other recommendations that you would have for the audience to work towards doing their part in this effort and in the progress towards greater environmental justice? So we'll start with Helen, we'll go to Martha, and then Galeeb.
I think quickly, and one last message is really for the families to have an emergency preparedness plan, to have sign up for emergency alerts if they're available, to make an emergency plan, to prepare a go bag for evacuations and include key information such as passports, money, in case they have to evacuate in such a rush. Develop a stay box that will include non-perishable food, first aid kits, supplies, and other essential needs. And help friends and neighbors to develop a disaster emergency plan, because during a disaster, we all have to sustain ourselves for at least 72 hours, because first responders are dealing with the catastrophic response. That's all.
I want to say that many of these vulnerable communities already feel like they're living in a climate emergency. If you go to where there are refineries, they're breathing in those fumes daily. So they're suffering the consequences on a daily basis of the flaring and the fumes. And I say that because it's not just about like the wildfires and the droughts that are coming, but it's about the emergencies that already exist. So I think what's really important to recognize and recall is that we want to make sure to be able to measure these investments that are coming from the federal government through the state to the municipal areas like Los Angeles, and ensure that at least 40% of those investments go into these vulnerable communities to create jobs, to create protection, to create monitoring, to create a revitalized economy that's based on a regenerative model, not just an extractive model, so that we can, again, envision a new future. And then the words climate aren't necessarily culturally sensitive to all communities. In fact, climate means weather to most people. So I would actually, work on the narrative for all of us working in this area to ensure that we're communicating that this is a health issue, that this is a livability issue, that this is an issue that affects the long-term longevity of these communities. And we're really talking about creating healthy, thriving communities for everyone. I mean, that's the outcome that we want to see, right? Healthy, thriving communities for everyone, whether it's an issue of the built environment or addressing air pollution. All of it intersects and creates either a solution or a cumulative impact. And unfortunately, these cumulative impacts are hard to target and pinpoint. So we have to deal with it very intersectionally, very holistically, and with a justice equity lens. And again, to reiterate, in order to do that and to be accountable, we have to be transparent and we have to monitor and we have to report on the numbers that we see once we've implemented those policies.
Thank you. And Galeeb?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think I look at it in the sense of taking off where I work. I work as a contractor for the federal government right now, but putting on the hat as an individual, as a Muslim, right? I think of the first is accepting and recognizing that climate change has radically upset communities. And sort of my, I hate to say favorite, but the most vivid example, if you go on Google Earth and you go to a place called North Cove in Washington State, and you look at a street called Spruce Street, and then you go back 20 years in Google Earth, you can do that with a satellite map. You'll see that street has gone, it's disappeared into the ocean already. And this is 2021. And I'll just put that reference into the text, into the chat. But the first is recognizing that climate change isn't something of the future. The impacts are already here, they've already started, and people can say they're tangentially related to hurricane increases or wildfire increases or drought increases. But if you have any doubt, look at that one street and imagine you are a homeowner living on that street 20 years ago, or you are the town getting income from those taxes. It's gone, right? The second thing then is to say, okay, as a Muslim, we're mandated by God in the Quran to be a steward of the earth, right? We're mandated to take care of the vulnerable. Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was an orphan, and there's a big emphasis on care for the orphans and the handicapped and the poor in the Quran and in all of the hadiths of the Prophet. We're reminded of equity and justice in a letter that Imam Ali wrote to the governor of Egypt, where he talks about, hey, you're a governor, but don't abuse your power, and you need to look after the vulnerable and the poor, and you need to have equity, and you cannot be corrupt. And then we have that constant reminder that we are Ashraf al-Makhluqat, we are the highest of all creation because we have the intellect that God gave us, that is more than the intellect of other living things. And then we have this constant reminder of the idea of pluralism. The Alcan Center for Pluralism up in Canada is a symbol of that, but the idea that we are all together pluralistic. I mean, just here on this panel, we bring forward very different perspectives that can help shape the problem and understand the problem and then solve the problem. So our collective brains are bigger than the sum of them. And so I'm putting this all together because what I'm saying is it's a huge problem and each of us can bring something to the table. So the idea is that everyone needs to get involved in their own way because it doesn't matter which angle you come at it. Climate change is a huge catalyst that's disrupting everything. And so we need every brain and everyone to participate.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you to all the panelists for those reflective thoughts and for the excellent work all of you are doing in helping to protect the earth and all its life forms. We had a really interesting discussion today, hearing at all levels. We talk often about from local to global, and we heard from the city of Los Angeles and what's happening there with community-based organizing and having marginalized communities have a seat at the table. We also heard at the state level on the devastating effects of climate change and the partnerships facilitated by Cal OES to mitigate some of those effects. And then at the global level, we heard both about aquaculture in this country, but efforts globally to mitigate and adapt to climate change in Pakistan and Kenya. And ultimately, as Martha said, to strive for the outcome that we're all seeking, healthy, thriving communities for all. We've received many questions from our audience to which we'd love to hear your thoughts. Let's turn to our first question. California provides much of the West's produce. With anticipated droughts, farmers' livelihoods are threatened, as well as water access to residents. Is there any long-term solution to access to water other than rationing? I'll open this up to the group if anyone has thoughts.
I'm definitely not an expert in this area, but I've read that salination of the water in the Central Valley is a huge problem. So we definitely need strategies to figure out why it's being so salinated, and if we can desalinate water in the Central Valley. I personally feel like Los Angeles has a great strategy not to import water by using this new technology called membrane bioreactive technology, where we will get to reclaim and recycle water. So I personally, this is my perspective, I don't believe we need desalination to create a water system for our city. And many cities actually are adopting this membrane reactive technology. And I think there's a possibility that areas like the Central Valley can look at innovative solutions like that, and possibly even desalination plants, but not for the ocean, but for the inner desert, inner Central Valley. And also corporate farming. Sometimes we overproduce, and we all know that sometimes that food production does not get utilized. So we have to be a lot more creative and curative on how we produce and how much we produce, and if it's actually being used. Yes, it is. We are the breadbasket of the world. That's one of our primary driving economies. But at this point, we have to be a lot more sensitive to the soil and create a system that helps itself regenerate, not one that wastes it and toxifies it, so that we can be here sustainably, right?
Yeah, no, that's definitely a great a great approach to thinking about it, in terms of not relying on ocean water to desalinate it, and not relying on the mountainous water, and to reduce the amount of water that the farmers actually use. But I think that the question is also a good example of how you can try and look for a silver bullet and not realize the unintended consequences. California is a model in a negative way, in the sense of how much water they move. They move tons of water every day to allow those farmers to farm. And what's happened in the past 40, 50, 60, 100 years is the fact that when you move that water, you're taking it away from other habitat. And so old rivers that used to meander down to the ocean and provide habitat for salmon are now gone, because they're now fast flowing, straight, channelized water, bringing water to farmers and to the cities. And so, most of the salmon that are on the endangered species list are from the Central Valley, because they don't have the water and habitat that they used to have in the past. So when you're trying to solve one problem, you end up creating a whole other problem, and in this case, more endangered species.
Excellent. Thank you both for that. We have a question on solar panels. It has been said that solar panels, solar farms, and wind farms cannot make much of a dent in the emission levels when industrial pollution and methane from dairy farms are also the major cause of emissions affecting the environment. So can actions by individuals really make a difference?
I would say that in the vulnerable communities in the city, the main source of disease and illness is vehicular traffic, right? So if we reduce vehicular traffic in the cities, that will eliminate a lot of these pre-existing conditions that made our communities more vulnerable to the pandemic, for example. I think there is a way to do carbon capture for farms and dairy farms. What I think we're trying to say at the city level is we don't want the natural gas infrastructure to expand. We want to replace it with a renewable energy economy. And if we replace fossil fuels with a renewable energy economy, with decarbonization, with switching over to renewable energy, whether it's solar, wind, geothermal, then we will begin to reduce emissions as a whole. But I want to make sure that as we do that, we also keep an eye at the neighborhood and granular level to ensure we're equitably reducing emissions there as well. And that main source of pollution is usually freeways and vehicular traffic. So I do think if we were able to invest in vulnerable communities and subsidize their purchase of EV chargers, cars, invest in putting solar panels in multifamily buildings, that would actually help reduce the pollution and the emissions in those vulnerable communities.
Yeah, and I think that that's a great example Marta gave about how you can tackle a global problem of climate change, but starting off at the community level and looking at the most marginalized and most vulnerable at their community level, because realizing it all adds up. And I think that theme of all adding up is how I would look at this question. You know, the question says, can individuals really make a difference? And, you know, President Biden just recently re-signed or recommitted to the, you know, the global climate initiatives here last week at the conference. And people can easily say that on one hand, yes, you can't have climate change, greenhouse gas emissions being reduced without the US at the table, right? And yet on the other hand, he said last week that the US is contributing what, 15–16% of those emissions. Well, if you say that it's only 15%, does it make a difference? Then you can argue, well, no, it doesn't, so we shouldn't play in that sandbox. Similarly, if you're an individual and you have some contribution to the problem, you can choose to stay out of it and let someone else solve it, or you can choose to take a role, step forward and play a role, you know, reduce your particular carbon footprint. And if you say the US has to reduce its footprint, that means you have to reduce your footprint because you make up that US's footprint. So I don't think it's a question of should individuals participate or go the extra mile or, you know, take the extra initiative. It's a matter of, it's a necessity. The other part of the question really about solar and wind, you know, they're all individually contributing to moving away from emissions, and whatever can be done to further speed that up, to reduce subsidies on factories that pollute more greenhouse gases is part of the solution. So I don't think it's a matter of saying yes or no. It's a matter of saying, looking at it as all adding up to a much bigger solution.
Excellent, thank you. And so we have one final question. This one is for Galeeb. And it really built off of what we learned earlier from Helen and all of the great work in the governor's office on agreements of cooperations and MOUs. So the question is, the agreements of cooperation and MOUs thereunder were intended to offer greater technology and knowledge transfer in both directions. Galeeb, were there solutions approaches developed by Focus or AKDN in Pakistan or Kenya that might offer solutions to challenges that we face domestically?
Gosh, that's a hard question. Unfortunately, I think that the technology transfer and knowledge transfer generally, unfortunately, happens one way, and it's not so much a matter of imperialism or colonialism. It's a matter of just where things have been tried and tested. The US has been facing, California has been facing natural disasters, you know, earthquakes, for example, but also mudslides, landslides, and drought and wildfires forever. Way before a lot of these countries, Kenya, Pakistan, whatever, became even independent. And so the US as a whole, with a policy governance framework built on the Constitution and on federalism, has been trying to solve these problems because they're holding themselves, the governments are holding themselves accountable to the people, right? And so these solutions have been experimented, have been tried and tested and worked on. And so it's easy to transfer that idea overseas. And I'll give you a really simple example. I was working in northern Kenya, as I mentioned earlier, on cattle rustling, which is being exacerbated by climate change, but it's always been there. And someone from the embassy just made some random comment to me and says, do you know that I think in Texas, there is a law enforcement group today that currently deals with cattle rustling? I was shocked. And we reached out, and sure enough, we found a group that was, I think, state law enforcement whose job it is to reduce cattle rustling. And so the idea was, now let's partner those historic ideas that have been going on since the 1800s and see what innovations or ideas they have that can help law enforcement in Kenya. So it's not a matter of imperialism or colonialism, it's a matter of how long you've been trying to solve a problem, whether successfully or unsuccessfully, what's worked and what hasn't worked. And how do you share those ideas and challenges? To come to the actual question, I've been out of focus for 20 years, so I don't really know what solutions they've come up with now. So I just don't know at this point, unfortunately.
Thank you. And I'd like to offer a moment if Helen wanted to react as well, considering the work that you do at the International Affairs Office, if you wanted to weigh in on that question.
Yeah, just quickly, working with the APD in focus, I think we always mutually share information. We learn from them and they learn from us. We've partnered on CERT teams, training. So every time we have a delegation that comes our way and with the AKDN, we are learning just as they're learning from us. So that's kind of what I would say.
Yeah, I don't have a international focus in my office, but I did want to, highlight an observation I made that as Germany transferred out or decommissioned its nuclear energy program, it has increased its reliance on coal and natural gas, right? And in contrast, France continues to rely on nuclear energy, and it is being able to provide, an example of cleaner energy. Now, I'm not pro or anti-nuclear. I'm just saying that it's interesting that these are examples of how an energy source is helping in some nations reduce the dependence on fossil fuels, and that fossil fuel usage all around the globe is also this national security issue. And Texas felt it more than any state in the nation when Saudi Arabia and Russia were having this cartel fight on the price of oil. But all of us were affected, and lots of bankruptcies of oil companies went into effect. There were mergers and acquisitions, and the price of oil fell dramatically. And we knew at that moment that was an example of why we have to really move and accelerate into a renewable energy future, so that we're not the victims of that kind of global economic crisis that indirectly and directly affects us all, right? So I kind of wanted just to put out that there are lots of great models out there, lots of knowledge we can all learn from. And it's really important to be open-minded and share so that we know those unintended consequences. Who knew, right, that when Germany moved away from nuclear, that they were going to increase their coal and natural gas intake, right? They want to be greener. They want to be the model of green, right? And also Mexico, just right now, the president, he wants a more national focused economic recovery. He doesn't want to depend on international sources of energy. So they're increasing their coal mining at a time when everybody else is talking about decreasing their fossil fuel intake. So we, in order to be a leader, we have to really be compassionate, understanding of other nations' economies and what they need for the recovery post-pandemic, so we can be the support system that they need, but also reach our goals of, reducing emissions and addressing the climate challenge.
Thank you. And thank you to all the speakers today and to the audience for joining us for this very important conversation. Hopefully this is just the start of the critical conversation on a topic that concerns all of us and future generations. Today was such a treat for me, as I hope it was for all of you watching. Special thanks again to our guest speakers for taking the time out on a Sunday to participate with us on this panel, and again to our audience for watching. Just a couple of announcements before you go. We are sharing some of the resources shared by the panelists in the chat box, including California's prepare and share toolkit and some of the executive orders that were mentioned. Please also look out for more info on akdn.org, b.ismaili/USA webpage, and social media pages for young adult conversations this week and for our next critical conversation. Please also take the survey at the end of the presentation that will pop out on your screen as you leave. Thank you again to our panelists and to our audience, and Yali Madat, everyone.